Right, hi everybody, welcome back. In my previous video on topic 5.3, soil degradation and conservation, I said that we'd look at some case studies to help support what we talked about there. So here is my promised bonus video. I thought we could look at 4 case studies. Remember, by the way, that case studies are important in the essay questions particularly, because in the essays you are expected to support claims that you make with specific examples from specific parts of the world. So I thought we could look at 4 things. First of all, I'd like to look at an example of subsistence farming, and I've chosen Ghana in Africa, and we'll compare that to intensive agriculture in Kansas in the US. Then we can look at an example of catastrophic erosion. I've chosen to look at the Dust Bowl event in the 1930s in the US, which you might be familiar with. Then we can look at an example of desertification, or the formation of desert. And we look at the Aral Sea. It's not actually a sea, it's an inland lake in Western Asia. And then finally we can look at an example of salinization, which also leads to a type of desertification. And we can look at South Australia, where that's become a huge problem at the moment. It extends from South Australia down into Tasmania. And I'll try and give you the reasons and the outcomes of that. Okay, so there's no need for me to look at the syllabus here. If you want to look at what the syllabus expects you to know, go back to the previous video, please, on topic 5.3 and take a look at that. And I'll move on. So what I've done for the example of subsistence farming compared to intensive farming, I wanted to show you actual footage of these farming methods. So I've just embedded 2 clips directly from YouTube. This first one that I'll show you is an example of subsistence farming in the Harvey region of Ghana. So hopefully I can play it and just speak over the clip as it plays. I'll just reduce the sound. Okay, so in this clip you can see driving into a town, Harvey. No industry to speak of, small houses, housing families, individual families, and those families farm with subsistence methods, as this guy is going to do here. The first thing I was going to say, that it's obvious that he's using manual labour, a lot of manual labour, but if you listen you can hear some an electric saw or something in the background. So obviously there is some availability of mechanised tools, but he's using hand tools here, very labour intensive obviously. He's farming in order to feed his family, I guess. I can't see other people helping him, but I guess this is a family settlement. You can see a large variety of plants behind him, of crops. I can't tell you exactly what they are, but obviously this is an example of polyculture rather than monoculture. Lack of access, I would suggest, to chemical fertilizers and chemical pesticides. Just watch him for a minute. If you can see that the soil to me looks very fertile, very loamy, very thick. He's just broken his hand tool there. He looks exhausted, and I guess it's not the most pleasurable work. But I was saying that the soil looks fertile, it's not exhausted as you might expect through intensive agriculture. The soil is less likely to be degraded. You can also see there the farm, and this one, small scale, not on the large scale as we'll see for cash crops. This is, I would guess, a separate family, and they're planting rice on a paddy farm. You can see this woman is there with her family, and unfortunately the labour again is very labour intensive, and it involves child labour as well. You can see children helping her there. Okay, I don't think there's much else we can see there, so I'll pause that. The second video here is a family farm in Kansas in the US. Reduce the sound. I think the first thing that you can see, obviously it's on a huge scale. And I think I said previously in the previous video that the average farm size in the US is around 200 hectares. This is possibly larger than that. I don't know if it's one farm or two separate farms. Obviously, mechanized, use of a lot of heavy machinery, very little manual labour. I think it would take very few people to farm this land. I think it would be wrong for me to say it's not hard work, but it doesn't involve a lot of manual labour like we saw previously. This is monoculture. They're farming one crop of wheat, and I would suggest that there's probably a lot more than one crop per year on this farm. I think they would have, well, I know they would have access to chemical fertilizers and chemical pesticides. Very, very high yields per square meter of land. This is a cash crop. They're not farming to feed their family, obviously, not on this scale. This is farming in order to make a profit and to sell a cash crop. There's a lot of intervention needed by the farmers to keep the soil fertile here. As I said before, the addition of chemical fertilizers and degradation of the soil is a lot more likely as a result, or it requires a lot more intervention to prevent that degradation taking place. Okay, I don't think we can say much more about that, so we can move on. So on the next slide, we can talk about the Dust Bowl of the 1930s in the US. So what happened was, in the 1920s and the early 1930s, in the breadbasket states of the US, the soil was over-farmed, basically, and it became very, very degraded and infertile as a result. It coincided with a long period of drought and a period of very intense windstorms. So because the soil became so degraded and so dusty, when these storms swept across these huge open pieces of land, one thing that happened was, in order to try to intensify the agriculture, windbreaks, trees were removed, deforestation occurred, pasture was dug up so that roots were not holding the soil together anymore. And as soon as these storms moved across the US, they picked up the soil and moved it. So that's an extreme example of wind erosion. So obviously the soil couldn't be farmed anymore. The soil was degraded or removed. People began to starve. Mass migrations of people looking for work. If you're familiar with the stories of John Steinbeck, you'll know about this. And another big part of this was a huge amount of lung disease and respiratory diseases caused by breathing in all of this very fine dust. The problem was solved eventually. We can talk about this a bit more in the classroom, by introducing fairly simple methods of looking after the soil. So like we said, planting grass, pasture to hold the soil together, leaving the soil fallow and not over farming it, not taking too many crops per year. Solved eventually, I guess, but that doesn't mean that it can't happen in the future, especially as we move more and more towards greater and greater intensive agriculture. Okay, so that's the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. This is the Aral Sea. Now, I think in the previous video I referred to it being in Eastern Europe. That's obviously nonsense. It's between two Asian countries. You can see here I've drawn the border between those two countries. It actually passes through the middle of the lake. In the north is Kazakhstan, and in the south is Uzbekistan, which are two former Soviet nations. And you can see on this map what's happened over the last 40, 50 years. I know you probably can't see the captions. This is the size of the lake in 1960. The second one is 1973. By the early 1970s, there were some signs that the lake was starting to shrink, and I'll tell you why in a minute. This is the mid-80s, 1987. Obvious effects start to be islands starting to form in the middle of the lake as the water level drops. Then this is 1989, 2008, 2009. By the mid-2000s, there was very little of the lake left. Now, I did refer to it as although it's called the Aral Sea, it is actually a lake. We shouldn't really call it a sea. It was a freshwater lake fed by rivers. And in the 1960s, or the early 1960s, it was the fourth largest lake in the world. Very little of it remains now. Now, the reason for that was that in the Soviet era especially, the rivers that fed the lake were dammed and diverted, largely because the Soviet government wanted to use the water to irrigate cash crops. It was largely cotton, actually, on the soils surrounding the lake. There wasn't much forward planning, and as the source of the water was diverted, the lake began to shrink. The water in the lake was also used for irrigation, pumped away. As the sea dried out, it left salt behind, and what was left after all these years of draining and not allowing water to enter the lake was a saline desert, so a salty desert, which was not suitable for growing crops. So it was a disaster all round. In addition, there was a large fishing industry in the lake, which was largely lost. And there's very famous pictures I'll show you in a minute of huge fishing boats that are basically trapped now in the middle of a desert. Because the rivers were dammed and because the level of the lake fell very rapidly, there was no way to get these huge fishing boats out of the lake before it dried. There's some slightly good news. There is some now recovery happening. Some sources of water have been diverted back to the lake, and it is starting to grow, but very, very slowly. There were huge social effects: loss of employment, loss of the fishing industry, mass economic migration, and as with the Dust Bowl, erosion of this dusty soil that was left behind has led to big problems of lung disease, respiratory diseases, especially in children. So it's a very sad story. UNESCO has labelled it as one of the worst environmental tragedies of the last 40, 50 years. So that's the loss of the Aral Sea and the desertification of the land that was left behind. A couple of pictures I can show you. So those are maps that I showed you before. These are actual satellite images. This is the lake in 1989. It was already a fraction of its previous size by then. And this was the lake in 2014, which is slightly later than the final map that I showed you on the previous slide. This is part of the fishing fleet that was left behind in the middle of a huge desert now. And you can see it's just scrubland. The only plants that grow there really are xerophytes, or plants that are adapted to live in desert conditions. There's no way to adapt that soil to grow crops, at least at the moment. And just a slightly happy note, this is the return of very low level of fishing back to the lake as a result of its efforts to try to replenish the water. Okay, so that's my example of desertification. And related to that, a direct example of salinisation, although there's crossover between these last two examples. This is South Australia. Now what's happened here over the last, again, 40, 50 years or so, indigenous plants have been taken away from soil in South Australia and been replaced with farmland, very often monoculture, very often because they're fast-growing plants in order to be harvested rapidly with very shallow root systems, to replace indigenous plants with very large, extensive, long root systems. Now what's happened as rainfall happens, because those root systems are so shallow, water is now able to percolate much more rapidly than previously through the soil, and that lifts up the water table. And especially in coastal areas where the aquifer contains salty water from seawater, the salt water rises up and enters the soil. The soil becomes salinised as a result, and crops are unable to grow. And you're left again with this desertification. As well as taking away the natural vegetation and this natural balance that kept the water table low and kept the right amount of water in the soil, is other examples of over irrigation, which again, like I said before, leads to salts building up in the soil as the water evaporates from the surface of the soil. So that's an example of salinisation, and it's very, very prevalent in South Australia. More and more soil is becoming useless. More and more of the land is becoming desertified as a result. And I've read that it's expected to take several generations to try to turn that around, if it's possible at all. Okay, so I hope those 4 examples were helpful and you can use them. Please make your own notes based on this. Maybe you can think of more examples or better examples, and you can discuss that in the classroom. All right, take care, everybody, and I will speak to you this week.